Hello and welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are talking about the case for life after death. And we are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. Dr. Mishlove's essay, Beyond the Brain, The Survival of Human Consciousness After Permanent Bodily Death, recently won the first prize in the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies essay contest. This contest has captured our attention because it invites essays presenting the case for the survival of human consciousness beyond physical death. The Bigelow winner receives $500,000, but that's hardly the most interesting thing about this. What's really interesting to us, at least, is that the consensual worldview of science is that spirit doesn't survive the body's death, and the consensual worldview of society is that the physical world, meaning things of form, are what's real here. But it's through the work of Dr. Mishlove, through our work here at the Circle, and through the work of countless others that we realize there's so much more going on. True reality is far stranger and far more interesting than we know. And if we can be open to new thinking and begin to shift our consensual worldviews, for example, what if it was commonly accepted in science that spirit does survive bodily death? And what if our societal view was that the physical is the illusion and spirit is what's ultimately real? What would this mean for how we approach death, for how attached we are to material things, and most importantly, for how we treat one another? As course students, we are constantly being asked to look beyond the body's errors to the true identity of ourselves and others, and that's the basis on which we forgive. What if that view wasn't spiritual fringe, but what if that view was just accepted as commonplace practice? For those of you who are regular listeners of this podcast, you know that we interviewed Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett several months ago. Sharon was one of the runners-up in the Bigelow contest. It was a fascinating conversation, and so we're really looking forward to speaking with you, Dr. Mishlove, because we know that you bring many, many years of experience and interest to this topic. I'll let Robert do the formal introduction, but thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So my familiarity with Dr. Mishlove's work goes way back to the 70s. He wrote the encyclopedic Study of Consciousness, The Roots of Consciousness, back in 75, which I owned and read much of in my earliest days in spirituality in the late 70s. He holds the sadly only doctoral diploma in parapsychology to be awarded by an accredited American university, that's UC Berkeley. From 1986 to 2002, he hosted the PBS television series, Thinking Aloud, where he interviewed scores of luminaries in the consciousness field, including some Course in Miracles personalities like Judith Skutch-Whitson, her husband Bill Whitson, Roger Walsh, along with Roger's late wife, Frances Vaughn. And he now hosts New Thinking Aloud, an ongoing YouTube-based series, as well as an audio podcast that I subscribe to. Yet, as Emily said, what really caught our attention was him winning the first prize. And I was so happy to see the prize money involved, because in my view, this whole field, as well as related fields, is so underfunded. It's treating some of the most important questions in our existence with practically no funding. So if a private company gives this kind of funding to an essay contest, that's wonderful. So anyway, I was so happy to see that you won first prize and to read your essay. So anyway, we're so honored to have you on the show, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Can you, just for our audience, briefly summarize the overall argument that you present in your paper? It's like nearly 100 pages,
Right.
But can you give us the sort of the elevator speech version?
Well, yeah, to put it simply, there are multiple lines of evidence, all pointing in the same direction. There's reincarnation research, near-death experience research. There's research on people who have spontaneous after-death communications, which is basically what I had. There's research on what is known as instrumental trance communication. There are, in other words, tens of thousands of hobbyists using computers and various electronic devices through which they communicate with deceased friends and relatives, and sometimes even strangers. There's research on mediums, not only mental mediums, but physical mediums. There's research on a phenomenon known as possession, or another way to think of that is replacement reincarnation, where this would be where a person, a living person, gets sick. They may be thought of as dead, and in some cases the family is ready for cremation, when all of a sudden the person sits up, only it's a different personality completely, sometimes speaking a different language, which is known as xenoglossy, when you can speak a language you've never learned. That's one of the other areas. So these are independent lines of research, but they all point toward the idea of the survival of human consciousness after death.
And Jeffrey, your paper is filled with story after story, like you've just described, stories of communication after bodily death. And given that so many of those stories have evidence, things that are verifiable within them, why do you think that this area is so underfunded and so largely ridiculed?
We live in a materialistic age. I, in my essay, refer to it as the dark age of scientism, where people are seduced by the attractions of the sensory world, and the idea of accumulating more and more possessions as if that will really make them happier. And as a result, particularly in academia and particularly in the sciences, people who explore parapsychology are ridiculed as being, infantile or something along those lines. Imagine, I got a doctoral diploma in parapsychology over 40 years ago, and no one else has subsequently done that. Although, to be fair, there are hundreds of people who do doctoral level research in parapsychology now. Only their degrees might say psychology or philosophy or something like that. So from my point of view, you can approach the field through philosophy or through experimental psychology, but parapsychology is a unique discipline in and of itself. And to be honest, since I know you're so actively engaged with the Course in Miracles, that may be a more direct way to encounter parapsychological realities than being an experimental psychologist.
How familiar are you with the course? Our assumption was that maybe you weren't. We weren't expecting you to be familiar with the course, but I'm pleased that you've brought it up. Do you have much familiarity with the Course in Miracles?
Well, I'm not a student of the Course in Miracles, but I've been friends with people like Judith Scutch and her husband, Bill Whitson, and on one occasion when I was still a graduate student in parapsychology, they invited me to dinner, and I met Helen Schuckman and Bill Thetford. And,
did you really?
Yes, I did.
That's great.
So I've always felt a sympathy, and of course Jerry Jampolsky as well was a friend. So growing up in or I should say coming of age in the San Francisco Bay Area, these people were just, part of the circle in which I moved.
Well, that's interesting. Sorry, I have to stop you right there. So you met Helen and Bill.
Yes.
At a dinner.
Yes.
when was that? And can you give us your impressions of both of them?
Well, it was nearly 50 years ago. They were very nice people. They seemed like regular people to me. They told me, their story, how they were professors at Columbia University and how they were struggling. As I recall, Helen said to Bill one day, there's got to be another way. They were caught up in the rat race of academia. And as a result, this material began coming through Helen. You could say it was channeled. And so, that was part of our dinner conversation. And I think they were eager to meet a young person who was taking all of this very seriously. And I think they made a point of wanting to befriend a person such as myself. And I was very happy to meet them.
What an interesting surprise
that
you've met both Helen and Bill.
They were together with Judy Scutch and her husband.
That's great. And that brings me to a question where I wanted to bring up your argument, which was about a bundle of arrows, in contrast to the typical leaky buckets argument. Can you explain the difference between those two?
Well, the bundle of arrows is what I was referring to earlier. In my essay, I'm pretty specific. There are 9 different independent lines of evidence, all pointing toward the survival of human consciousness, what we call post-mortem survival of consciousness. So normal inductive logic works that way. You take the facts, you analyze the facts and look at where they point. And the idea of the bundle of arrows, you can actually see it on the Great Seal of the United States of America. There's an eagle holding 13 arrows. And in the days when the United States was founded as a country, as I recall, there was a time in which a Native American appeared before the founding fathers at one of their meetings, and he had a bundle of arrows, and he took one arrow and snapped it like that, said how easy it is to break an arrow in half. Then he took a bundle, like 13 arrows, and he tried to break them over his knee, but they wouldn't break. He said, that's because in unity there is strength. So the principle in politics is well known, that when you have numerous, let me put it differently, when you have a union of states, political entities, and they come together, they're stronger because they're unified. And the same thing is true in the intellectual realm. That's inductive logic. So the counter argument is, each individual arrow, let us say, is weak. It can be broken. Therefore, the bundle isn't strong. But actually, statisticians have looked very carefully at these competing arguments, and it turns out that the inductive reasoning argument that the bundle of arrows is stronger than any individual arrow is the statistically stronger argument of the two. It is true. Sometimes you can take a lot of, let's say, misinformation or disinformation and put it all together and think you've got a wonderful conspiracy theory. I don't believe in conspiracy theories by and large. I don't discount the possibility that some might be real, but there's a lot of flimsy thinking going on based on misinformation. But the evidence in parapsychology is carefully gathered empirical studies, case histories that have been researched over 150 years, over 1,000 studies published. That's strong evidence when you put it all together. Does that make sense to you?
It does, yeah. What I see oftentimes, and referring to the whole, I'd never heard the term leaky buckets argument, but I see the principle a lot where a so-called skeptic will say, well, we can poke holes in this particular story. We can poke holes in this particular story. And then by doing that, they think they have dispensed with that entire category.
Yeah.
And what that lacks in my eyes, first of all, a lot of times the holes are poked based on just pure conjecture, not based on specific evidence that there was a problem. But also, what that approach doesn't do is it doesn't explain the patterns between different cases. What are those patterns doing there? Poking holes in individual cases doesn't explain what they have in common.
Yeah, it's easy to poke holes in any particular fact. And this is very, very difficult. I mean, we live in an era today where millions of people subscribe to conspiracy theories that are dangerous. I mean, there's a lot of violence going on in our society because people take these theories that are insubstantial to heart. But that's not the same as looking at the data for life after death. These are not flimsy theories made up for political purposes. These are ideas that have been studied by serious researchers, some of the greatest minds in our culture, people like William James, the founder of American psychology, going back 150 years, that have been carefully examined over and over again by generation and generation of researchers, and have withstood the test of time.
And Jeffrey, I don't want to belabor this point, but I really did personally feel like that was among the strongest features of your essay, this idea of the bundle of arrows argument, because as we're all saying, you can take an individual story of this incident or that incident, and you can start to poke holes in it and break that one arrow. But your essay is 98 pages of story after story after story. And as I mentioned before, many of these stories have evidence, have things that are verifiable to them. And when you start to put all of those together, it weaves together, and it's harder to break, just like that bundle of arrows. So that was one of the things that I appreciated most about your writing. As we were going through, Robert noted that instead of skeptics, you say scoffers, and we were just wondering if you had any reasoning behind that language. I'm sure you do.
Well, thank you for asking, because that's a very important point. Philosophical skepticism, to be a true philosophical skeptic, the first thing you want to do is to call into question your own ideas. A true skeptic is skeptical of themselves first and foremost. A true believer is just the opposite. And people today, these professional skeptical organizations, really, for the most part, fall into the category of true believers rather than philosophical skeptics. So I prefer to call them scoffers. At one point, I thought of them as debunkers, but then my good friend Stanley Krippner said, no, if a debunker has to have bunk in order to debunk. And so the very term debunker suggests there's something worthy of being debunked. But a scoffer is really what these people are. And in fact, some of the most prominent people I've interviewed, like James Alcock, who is one of the most prominent people in the so-called skeptical movement. In 2018, finally, the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association published a review article on the evidence for parapsychology, and it covered some 1,400 experimental reports that have been published in peer-reviewed journals for psychic phenomena, and showed that the evidence statistically for the paranormal is what we say it's at the 6 sigma level, meaning that the odds that you would get all of this evidence by chance are something like 1 in a billion. The evidence is that strong over hundreds of laboratories all around the world, independently replicating extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, and other paranormal effects. So what is a scoffer? like James Alcock to do. In response, he published an article saying it doesn't matter how good the evidence is, because as far as he's concerned, it's impossible. He says it contradicts the laws of reality, as if he were a physicist who understood the laws of physics, which he is not.
Which is so odd to me, because science is all about the evidence. Before science, we had this theorizing, oftentimes in the absence of any testing. And what science has done is brought into our world the idea that we should be open and form our theories based on specific, measurable, testable evidence. And yet, when it comes to things like parapsychology, you hear this kind of thing. That's essentially what Noam Chomsky was saying, was we can dismiss the evidence because we know it can't be true.
Yeah, it's sad, but at the end of the day, scientists are human beings, and they are subject to their own peculiar human nature. And there are many, many examples in the sociology of science where they don't behave according to the ideal principles of the scientific method. They behave according to their own prejudices. And in fact, it was Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, who once said that science advances one funeral at a time.
Yeah, it's a great saying. Yeah, there's so much I want to talk about in relation to the scientific and intellectual side of this. I think that for time's sake, we probably should move forward, Emily, to our more kind of practical, rubber hits the road sorts of questions. So do you want to go ahead with those?
Absolutely. Okay. So practical question, Jeffrey. From all the work that you've done in your research and your interviews, what do you think happens when we die?
If you look at the reports of people who have had near-death experiences, the idea of course, it varies a lot from person to person, but sort of the archetypal description is they're moving through a tunnel towards the light. They come to a place where they find themselves surrounded by their loving relatives, greeting them, welcoming them. They're often spiritual guides. They may have a life review in which they experience their previous life moment by moment. And often not only from their own perspective, but from the perspective of all the people that they touched in their lives, positive or negative. So they get to feel what it was like if they hurt somebody. And this can take place in Earth time in a matter of moments. But so time is very different on the other side as well. This seems to be what I would describe as the early stages of the afterlife. And then there are many other reports from people like Frederick Myers was a great psychical researcher, died in 1903, as I recall. And sometime in the 1930s, after being in the afterlife for 30 years, dictated a book to an automatic writer named Geraldine Cummins, 2 books. One of them is called The Road to Immortality, and the other Beyond Human Personality, in which he goes into great depth describing what it's been like over there on the other side for all these years. So we have some very interesting descriptions of what it's like, going back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Tibetan Book of the Dead as well.
Life reviews
One of the things,
are
go ahead.
Just quickly, life reviews are so interesting. They show up repeatedly in near-death experiences, and also in more and more, I'm hearing about them in psychedelics. So people will be having a psychedelic experience, hopefully under the right conditions with a shaman or a counselor, but a life review will come through, and again, what I was saying in the intro is, how would we live our lives differently if we took these things seriously? That, at the point of your death, you will have a life review where you are confronted with how you made other people feel. How would we live our lives differently in these bodies if we knew that's what was coming for us? We would probably treat each other a lot better than we do right now. And so it's just more evidence to take these things seriously. And I love that so many of your stories and what you're saying now points to life reviews too, because we talk about them a lot here as well.
Yeah, about, as I recall, some 20% of people who have a near-death experience and come back to talk about it have had the life review. And well, you brought up psychedelic experience as well. So this is a good point for me to mention that the near-death experience, the psychedelic experience, meditative experiences, different forms of lucid dreams are all what you could call mystical experiences. They're all in many ways quite similar. The difference between a person who's had a psychedelic experience and somebody who we can acknowledge today as a great saint or mystic isn't so much the experience that they've had, it's the way they live their lives. Now, a lot of people have psychedelic experiences, but then they jump right back into the materialistic world and they're out partying. They consider it a form of recreation. However, if you look at the lives of the great mystics, what you see is they dedicate their lives in one way or another to making the world a better place. And it's a struggle for a lot of people I know who have had near-death experiences. Then they come back, but their old life is still there waiting for them, their old habits. Typically, if, let's say, you're a business person, business people are in the habit of I would say engaging in little white lies, sometimes big lies, whenever they can for personal advantage.
You're speaking our language on that, Jeffrey, because Robert and I are constantly talking about how the ultimate in spiritual growth, yes, it's mystical experience, but it's also interpersonal achievement. And what I mean by that is, are you more loving? And the course in particular is a path of shedding the ego, shedding that separation from others. And so if you want to demonstrate that you're spiritually advanced, be more loving to one another. And so you can have the most amazing spiritual experience, but as you're saying, you come back and your ego is just as intact as it's always been, then how spiritually developed are you really as a result of that? So yeah, we get it.
Yeah.
Robert, did you want to say anything else?
Oh, there's just too many things to say. Let me ask another question. Speaking of our relationships, what implications, so much of the evidence you present goes really beyond evidence simply that we survive bodily death. It argues for the nature of reality being profoundly different than what we believe it is. It argues for this world at the least being less real than some, invisible, pristine realm of spirit. So what implications do you see in the evidence that you've presented and that, you've learned over the years for how we conduct our relationships, how we interact with each other, both friends, family, and strangers?
One of the unique characteristics of people who have had the near-death experience, they almost universally report a feeling of overwhelming love. I interviewed, for example, Elizabeth Crone, who is the co-author with Professor Jeffrey Kripal of a book called Changed in a Flash, One Woman's Near-Death Experience and Why a Scholar Feels that it's of benefit to all. And she was struck by lightning. And she said she experienced such a powerful sense of love. And then she said to me, and it was nothing like earthly love. I'm a mother. I know what unconditional love is like on the earthly plane. But this was another level completely, where you aren't just experiencing this sense of love as a witness, you become it. The idea of self and other, the boundary between self and other. We normally live our lives in the material world that way. There's inside the skin, that's me, and everything else is the outer world. That boundary dissolves entirely, and it's just filled with unconditional love for everyone and everything all the time. That's very hard for us to digest when we're here in a body. William Blake, the great poet, said, the fact that a loving God has created a world in which there's, war, famine, and disease, those realities are incomprehensible to the normal human ego. We can't reconcile those things normally. But when you're in that space, all of a sudden you have a cosmic perspective, and it seems quite clear. It's very hard to then come back and explain it to people after you've had that experience. I think that's one of the beauties of the Course in Miracles, actually, is it takes people step by step by step to that realization.
Yeah, a miracle, the primary definition of a miracle in A Course in Miracles is an expression of love that has a healing effect on the other person that in turn heals you. And I think with NDEs and with psychedelics and with mystical experiences, you can kind of have a direct experience of that unconditional love. And what implications would that have for how we treated each other if we understood what true love really is? And I like what you said about the mother. I'm a mother too. I know what unconditional love is like here in the world. Our kids test us on that all the time. But when it comes to the universal spiritual love, that's what we're trying to tap into. And I just love that in so many of these examples of life after death, people come back with that love. And what it shows is that the nature of reality, the true nature of reality, is that love. And if we put our faith in that, then we can live different lives here in these bodies. We can be less attached to material things and more loving as a result.
Well, it's especially important in this era today, and around the world. Politics is becoming more and more polarized. People live in silos where I love the people in my silo and I hate the people in the other silo. And that's very detrimental to our culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very tribal.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I find interesting is you hear repeatedly those analogies of like the best love on earth does not compare remotely. One of the ones that Emily and I quote a lot is from a guy named Andy Petro. And he said, if you take the very best love on earth, it's like a match. And and then the love on the other side is like the sun. Like, how does a match compare to the sun? And A Course in Miracles has some very similar imagery, all of it adding up to the idea that on earth, we just don't know what real love is. Mm-hmm. And our love is so tiny and so fickle and so preferential compared to the love that presumably we are all journeying toward.
Yeah, and I know we're coming up to the top of the hour here, Jeffrey, but I'd just love to hear from you. I know we're touching on this now, but from your work, what does this mean for how we can live our lives differently every day? What should we take from an understanding that human consciousness does survive physical death? How can we take that idea and practically apply it to how we go through our day?
Well, I don't have all the answers for sure, but I can share something that is important to me. And I was raised Jewish. I'm not a Christian, but one of the phrases of Christ that I like a lot from the Bible is love your enemies. And I try to make a point when I'm meditating of thinking of people with whom I have had disputes and arguments. Sometimes, there are people who have been very nasty toward me. And I try to, in particular, find a place in my heart where I can open up and feel love for those people as well. I think, I find that to be one of the most important spiritual exercises in my own life.
Yeah.
That's great. That we reference that teaching all the time because it's very Course in Miracles like, even though it's like straight out of the Gospels, of course.
Yeah.
One question I have: what do you see as the near future trend for scientific acceptance of some of these things? I mean, you keep hearing people say it's around the corner. I'm very doubtful about that. If you look at 140 years since the Society for Psychical Research was founded, with some incredible luminaries intellectually, I don't even know how far we've come since then. So what do you see as the future holding for parapsychology and consciousness studies?
One of the things I've come to appreciate from the study of survival of consciousness is that the human race might go extinct, but consciousness will survive. So I think at this point, we have to do our best, whether regardless of the outcome. We can't worry about, are we going to be successful or not? The point is to act as if we might be successful and never give up.
Robert and I only half jokingly call the podcast we want to record Halting the Advancement of Civilization, because there are gatekeepers to this type of knowledge getting out into the world. And those gatekeepers, skeptics, scoffers, as you call them, are very powerful. And Robert and I were talking yesterday that one of their chief weapons is ridicule. I mean, you get ridiculed enough and you start to back away from these ideas. Why is it that you have the only doctorate in parapsychology? I suspect because there's a lot of people who may be interested in doing the same, but are too scared to step forward and say, you know what, I really think this is real. I want to study it. I want to get some funding for it, et cetera, et cetera. But until that happens, then society and human civilization is halted. And then we're at the effect of the same old, same old. Why is it, for example, that Putin thinks that he can just march into another country and take over? Why is it that we see so much toxicity in our politics? Why is it that we see so much dysfunction in our own homes? Could it be because we don't see each other as inherently equal? Could it be that we don't see our shared oneness? Could it be that it's because we don't understand the effects of the ego in our own psyches and in our own lives? If we had more of a spiritual worldview, I think we would see these things more clearly. We would see the oneness of all humans and all spirit, and we would see the distinctions within the oneness, which inspire us to take care of one another. But until we start to have more of a spiritual worldview, we aren't going to have the tools to heal the world in the way in which it needs healing. So, Jeffrey, we're at the top of the hour now, so we'll go ahead and leave it there. But just thank you for your work. I remember saying something very similar to Sharon Wallette when we interviewed her. It's really trailblazing stuff, and we hope that as you put more of your work out into the world, you'll inspire more people to follow in that trail that you're blazing, which makes it easier for the work that we do to say, A Course in Miracles is real. It's channeled. It came from Jesus, and to not have that be ridiculed, but to have that be taken seriously. And when it's taken seriously, so much changes as a result. So that was a long way of saying thank you, but thank you.
Well, thank you for the work that you're doing as well. It's a real pleasure to connect with you.
Likewise. Robert, is there anything that you want to say before we close?
Way too much. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
It's
All right.
been really great to have the conversation with you. I wish it could be like a 5-hour one, but thank you so much for joining us.
You're
Yeah.
very welcome.
All right. Bye for now, everyone. Thanks for joining us.